Good morning, gardeners, and welcome to Wednesday, May 17th. My name is Catherine, and I created a show called Good Morning Gardeners, even though I can't grow green things, because I'm referring to gardening metaphorically. We're planting the seeds for a better day. We're starting our day by getting in the right mindset to cultivate a better life for ourselves, better communities, and a better world. Today is the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. This day was originally known as the International Day Against Homophobia, or Idaho for short. Today's expanded acronym can be pronounced as IdahoBit. The founders chose May 17th to commemorate the decision to remove homosexuality from the International Classification of Diseases of the World Health Organization in the year 1990. More than a third of countries criminalize same-sex relationships today. Only 24 allow same-sex marriage. Violence against LGBTQIA+ persons is consistently high, and cases are often underreported. An equal world depends on recognizing and respecting diverse communities. With that in mind, the theme for the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia this year is Together Always, United in Diversity. You can learn more and get involved by visiting may17.org. So today I'm going to chat with you a little bit about one of my latest obsessions, and that is Malcolm Gladwell's masterclass. I got a masterclass subscription for Mother's Day, and I have been listening to this class with every spare minute ever since for the past, 2 to 3 days. Now, generally, when I listen to things, I try to make it pretty lighthearted and not too intellectually stimulating. And the reason for that is because I read a lot. I have been writing a lot recently. I have been talking to you, which actually, involves writing as well. So at the end of the day, my brain is usually tired. So I probably overdid it on this class a little bit yesterday by just, like I said, cramming it into every spare minute. But it's been worth it because, I've really been enjoying it. I wanted to share with you one of Malcolm Gladwell's tips on interviewing. Now, if you don't already know, Malcolm Gladwell is an author, so the class is on writing. I am not a professional writer, but I am kind of an amateurish writer, or you could call me an aspiring writer. So yeah, that's why I've been so into it lately. Now, Malcolm Gladwell, with his style of writing, he interviews a lot of people. Me personally, I don't know if I would ever interview anyone for my writing. But regardless of whether I would ever interview anyone, this tip was really, I think it could be useful to anyone because, as Malcolm Gladwell says, when you are interviewing someone, you are basically just having a conversation with them. And if you want to get to the really interesting tidbits that the person has to offer you, you want them to open up. And whether you're interviewing someone or just, getting to know someone or just killing time and having a conversation, aren't all of those things better if the person you're speaking with can open up? I would say yes. So the tip is this. If you ever hear someone, offer you like an interesting factoid, anything that starts with, did you know that blah, 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 or have you heard of that thing where blah, blah, blah? Even if you've heard of it, do not just say like, oh yeah, I know, I've heard of that, or oh yeah, I know all about that. Especially don't interrupt them, don't stop them before they get going. But even if they pause, say something that doesn't shut it down. And I think that there is, especially among like maybe academic people, nerds, people who like to collect ideas, people who pride themselves on how much they know, there is definitely an impulse to just be like, oh, yes, I know that. Like, I've already assimilated that. I've already collected that idea, so you can move on and give me something that I don't know. But this, not only might this actually come off as rude, it shuts down the conversation. As Malcolm Gladwell says in Masterclass, having a conversation is risk. Telling someone something is risk, because if you tell someone something, that person that can then, ridicule you, shame you, judge you, shut you down, ignore you, or in this case, they could just dismiss you, and they could be like, oh yeah, no, I've heard all about that. Nothing new to me. So there is the compassionate point, or the considerate point to remember, which is, don't shut someone down if they're sharing something with you, because then, you're going to make them feel bad, and you don't want to do that. But also, there's usefulness in bringing in a little humility to your own approach, because, maybe you have heard of this idea before, but are you the expert on this idea? Do you know every single thing about this idea? Have you considered it from every perspective? It is very possible that the person who says, have you heard of blah, 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 is going to tell you something else, maybe just a small little tidbit, or it might just be the difference of their perspective. But it might add to your knowledge of this thing by just 2%. And isn't that worth it, especially when you consider that, you might make them feel bad by shutting them down? Not to mention, if you want, you tell you more things that you have never heard of, they're going to be much more likely to open up about more things if you don't shut them down about this thing. So, Malcolm Gladwell speaks about being a good conversationalist in his class, and that might be one of the only times I've heard someone speak about conversation in that way. I love a good conversation, but I've never thought of it as like an art or a skill before. So that is really, really interesting to me. I hope it's interesting to you as well. And if you have Masterclass subscription, I do highly recommend Malcolm Gladwell's class. Okay, so let's move on to our feel-good moment for today. Now, if you listened to yesterday's show, you may recall that there was kind of a theme to that episode, which was that good people can have bad takes and bad people can have good takes. That was actually our feel-good moment for yesterday as well. Well, our feel-good moment for today is the opposite. And that is that most of the time, good people are the ones with good ideas and bad people are the ones with bad ideas. Of course, calling someone bad or good is a shorthand way of judging that person's values. If we judge that a person has good values and generally lives by them, we think of them as a good person. And while it is important to check yourself now and then to, zoom out and look at things from a different perspective, I think that most of the time you can get by on just trusting your gut. Even though I don't usually know the authors of the books I read personally, I usually get a gut feeling about the author based on the ideas they present. And that leads us to our learning moment for today, in which I am going to give you an example of what I consider to be a bad person giving a bad take. Now, repeating the phrase bad person again and again is making me pretty uncomfortable. So just to reiterate, I am only using that as a shorthand. Philosophically, I don't know if I really believe in the concept of good or bad people. So I'm just kind of using it as a shorthand for, a person's values and, how they live by them. And it's, take it with a grain of salt, and comment down below if you have a better shorthand for referring to that kind of thing. So today I am going to be reading to you from 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. And I will not only tell you exactly why I think what I'm going to read to you is a bad take, but I'm also going to tell you why I'm getting the sense, even though I don't know him personally, that Thiel is what I would call a bad person, just from reading the book. But first, some context. In 2008, Malcolm Gladwell published a book called Outliers, The Story of Success, which made an argument that can be pretty difficult for some of us to swallow. Unfortunately, I don't have a physical copy of this book, and I didn't feel like skipping around the audiobook this morning, so I'm going to summarize it from my memory. Please feel free to leave corrections or anything that I am leaving out in the comments. Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers argument is that the outliers in our world, or the very successful people, became that successful because basically they got very lucky in very specific ways. As I'm sure you can imagine, this argument is not pleasant for those of us who like to believe that our destiny is in our own hands. I wrestled with the ideas in Outliers for quite some time after reading it, and honestly, I still am to some extent. But I ended up mostly settling it for myself by, acknowledging internally that yes, many things are outside of my control. But this is exactly why I should only focus on what I can control. All right, so let's get into 0 to 1, which was published in 2016. Now here, Thiel, who co-founded PayPal, is talking about indefinite optimism versus definite optimism. He writes, "To a definite optimist, the future will be better than the present, if he plans and works to make it better. From the 17th century through the 1950s and 60s, definite optimists led the Western world. Scientists, engineers, doctors, and businessmen made the world richer, healthier, and more long-lived than previously imaginable." So that is definite optimism. And obviously, Thiel is a big fan of definite optimism, and his whole argument is basically that we need definite optimism to make a comeback. So here's what he writes on indefinite optimism. After a brief pessimistic phase in the 1970s, indefinite optimism has dominated American thinking ever since 1982, when a long bull market began and finance eclipsed engineering Indefinite optimism has dominated American thinking ever since 1982, when a long bull market began and finance eclipsed engineering as the way to approach the future. To an indefinite optimist, the future will be better, but he doesn't know how exactly, so he won't make any specific plans. He expects to profit from the future, but sees no reason to design it concretely. So, at face value, nothing I've read so far sounds out of pocket. I agree that planning is important, and I like the sound of definite optimism, but I'm already noticing that this is starting to look like a very binary argument. But this next part is where Thiel really loses me. He brings up Malcolm Gladwell. He says, "Malcolm Gladwell says you can't understand Bill Gates' success without understanding his fortunate personal context. He grew up in a good family, went to a private school equipped with a computer lab, and counted Paul Allen as a childhood friend. But perhaps you can't understand Malcolm Gladwell without understanding his historical context as a boomer, born in 1963. When baby boomers grow up and write books to explain why one or another individual is successful, they point to the power of a particular individual's context as determined by chance. But they miss the even bigger social context for their own preferred explanations. A whole generation learned from childhood to overrate the power of chance and underrate the importance of planning. Gladwell, at first, appears to be making a contrarian critique of the myth of the self-made businessman, but actually his own account encapsulates the conventional view of a generation." So I am just now noticing that this episode might be a bit longer than usual. So sorry if you don't like that. And if you wish that the episodes were generally longer, give me a thumbs up on the video. Okay, so let's get back to the Peter Thiel take on Malcolm Gladwell. When I first read that, it kind of struck me like a gotcha moment. Like, this is an episode of Scooby-Doo, and someone reveals the thoughtful author mask. Someone removes the thoughtful author mask, and underneath is just the face of a boomer. Like, you can't be both. Anyway, like I said, I do agree with Thiel on some points, but overall, I think his entire chapter on definite and indefinite optimism and everything else included in the chapter is a bust, because he's creating a black and white picture of the world. Now, in this example, it's like there's one wrong way to be, which is indefinite, and one right way to be, definite. Also, Bill Gates himself, I believe, I could be wrong, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I believe he has stated openly that he got very lucky by being born into a good family, going to a private school with a computer lab, and being Paul Allen's childhood friend. So I'm sure that Bill Gates would welcome Malcolm Gladwell putting his success into context. But Thiel's way of putting Malcolm Gladwell into context is nothing but stating the year he was born. That's extremely broad and has very little to do with the topic at hand. It almost reads as if you should disregard everything any boomer says because their entire generation learned to overrate the power of chance and underrate the importance of planning. By the way, Bill Gates is a boomer as well, and his birthday lands more solidly within the baby boomer timeline because he was born in 1955. And the boomer birthdays range from 1946 to 1964. So actually, Malcolm Gladwell, born in 63, is just barely a baby boomer since he was born 1 year before the end of this range. And guess what? Peter Thiel was born a mere 4 years after Malcolm Gladwell. I'm serious, I looked this up. So Thiel escaped the arbitrary boomer label by a mere 3 years, and now he's out here publishing a book with a gotcha critique on a celebrated author, the critique being the author's birth year, which isn't all that far from Thiel's birth year. It's one thing to publish an argument that's predicated on ageism alone, but it's another thing if that age you're slandering is basically your own age. So hopefully it's already becoming obvious why I'm getting the sense that Thiel is that Thiel has what I would call bad values. But here are some more reasons I'm getting the feeling that he's not a great person just from reading this chapter alone. He states that the existence of super successful serial entrepreneurs, meaning people who launch multiple billion-dollar companies, proves that success is not a matter of luck. But he gives no acknowledgement of the momentum aspect to financial success, meaning that having a lot of money makes it a lot easier to earn a lot more money. This makes me think he's not aware of his privilege. Also, he criticizes all of Europe as being stagnated, having made very little to no progress in recent decades. And at one point, he even suggests that all Europeans are slackers. Now, I have lived in Europe for a couple years now, and while I've definitely noticed that they have a much different culture than the States does when it comes to working, I've also noticed that they have renewable energy literally everywhere. You can't take a drive without seeing windmills or solar panels. To me, this looks like progress, especially when I compare it to the energy landscape of the United States. So I'm starting to think that Thiel didn't rigorously vet his claims before publishing them in his book, and that he's not opposed to using social stereotypes to write off entire populations. Now, I could go on, but the episode is going long, and I'm sure you get the idea. So now it's time to get our mind into focus mode. And as you continue preparing for your day, I want you to think about your own values. Maybe you've already taken the time to write out a distinct list of your highest values in the past, but if you haven't, and if you have some time this morning, I would highly recommend doing this. If you don't want to take the time to write it out just now, maybe just try to mentally identify a few values that are very important to you. A few of mine are honesty, fairness, and optimism. I think that the more in touch we get with our values, and the more we practice identifying thoughts that don't align with our values, and thoughts that do align with our values, the more confidence we can build up in our own judgment. Not only how we judge ideas, but also our judge of character. The more you get to know yourself, the better you can process ideas. And the more you do this, the easier it is for you to trust your gut. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you have a wonderful day. I will speak with you again tomorrow.